Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today, Negotiating Total Compensation, How to Value Yourself and Get What You Deserve, presented by Mark Friedman, Principal in MJF Associates. My name is Mara. I'm the Content Manager at Ivy Exec, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll address your questions at the end. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Mark Friedman. Mark is a principal in MJF Associates that specializes in executive coaching, leadership development, strategic focus, team building, career management, and outplacement. During the last 25 years, Mark has helped over 3,000 people in career transition. He received his PhD in industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Tennessee and has over 25 years of experience. Over 8 years, he has coached some 55 executive MBA candidates at Rice University on leadership, career management, and change management. His clients include Air Liquide, Praxair, National Oilwell Varco, Port of Houston Authority, FMC Technology, LyondellBasell, BP, ExxonMobil, City of Houston, U.S. Postal Service, the Houston Texan, Hewlett-Packard, Dell, Johnson Controls, and ABB Loomis Global. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Mark. Mark, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Mara. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I hope that this presentation provides tools for all of you. I appreciate your all signing up and coming to the webinar. This is a very important topic, and it's one that provokes a lot of anxiety and nervousness when people get to this point in the interviewing process. The truth of the matter is that it takes some homework during the whole job search process, and we'll discuss that. I know I had a client who had several interviews, and she received an offer, and what I told her was to not accept the offer until she had an opportunity to talk to me first. So she got the offer, she called. She happened to be in California. We had this discussion over the telephone, and we discussed it, and she went back and she was able to negotiate for $5,000 more, just like poof, by asking for it. And so it makes a big difference, not only because of the initial amount that you can get, but if that's a part of your salary, there's a multiplier effect that takes place, because as you get increases, the increases are based on what your base salary is. And so if your base salary is higher, the percentage is going to multiply that higher amount when you get your increases based on whatever percentage you're getting as increases. So this is a very important topic. This is a little bit about my background, but Mara's already introduced me, so we'll move on to what we'll cover. What is total compensation? I want to speak specifically about the term total compensation and what that means, because sometimes people miss this and they think only about their pay, and we need to think about the broader context when we think about compensation, and we'll get to that. We'll talk about the overview of the job search process and where negotiation fits in. We'll talk about the need for a self-assessment and preparation and research. I'll share with you some critical negotiations, questions and answers. And finally, we'll summarize it by sharing some of a legend actually in career management. His name is Richard Bowles. He's written a book called What Color Is Your Parachute? And the book has been around for some 30 years, and he's updated it every year. He passed away recently, but his organization continues to update the book, and it comes out as an annual. And again, we'll speak more about that as we go on. So let's look at this issue about what total compensation is. Total compensation is equal to salary plus benefits. I had a friend in New York who had 2 job offers, and she was telling me about the first job offer and how good it was, and that she was being offered $55,000, but no benefits. And in the second, and I'm just making this up, for example, in the second situation, she was being offered $50,000, but she was being offered vacation and medical benefits and the like. And so when we were talking about it, she said, I think I'm going to take the one with $55,000 because it's going to be more money. And I said, well, hold on a second. Let's talk about this and see. What is it going to cost you for medical benefits? And how much is it going to cost you, even if you have a minimum amount of coverage for your share as you go on, if you don't have the insurance? And when she started to look at it, the medical benefits and whatnot were worth about $12,000. So if you add 50 and 12, you're looking at total compensation of about $62,000, not to mention that there was vacation and holidays that were also in that one and not in the prior offer of $55,000. So it's a matter of really thinking through what's important to you and which offer is going to give you the best outcomes. So what's negotiable? And the answer is everything. And so we'll talk about what that means and what might be included in that. There's an organization by the name of Wright Associates who does a lot of outplacement and career management and also consulting with organizations. And they identified at least 70 factors that can be used to evaluate if a job is right for you. And so we're going to talk about some of those factors just to give you a sense of some of the things that you can negotiate. In putting together this presentation, I found this cartoon and I thought it was apt, and so I included it here. And the candidate is looking at the interviewer with the package on the table, and she says, I have to admit, it is a very attractive package. So let's look at some of the factors to evaluate. There's a number of different areas, as you see: company focus, job focus, compensation, relocation, personal focus, and community focus. Of course, the size of the company, the sales volume, the management depth, the profitability, vulnerability are issues that you need to consider. I had a client who was the national director of sales in a healthcare situation. And he had identified basically a startup company that had been around for several years. And it looked like they had been doing very, very well. And just for grins, I did a quick search on Google to learn a little bit more about the company. And what I found was that they had been growing at a very fast rate, but over the last year, they had dropped by about 50%. And when he came back and we were visiting, I started to talk with him about that. And I said, are you aware that their sales had dropped and revenues had dropped by about 50%? And what does that mean? And what about the stability? And what about your vulnerability in taking a job there? And so he said, maybe I need to reconsider that. Of course, you can also negotiate duties and responsibilities, independence, authority, etc. Some of the things that I have outlined in red: vacations and sick time, wellness benefits, but in particular vacations and time off. If you're a senior employee and you've had, let's say, 10 or 15 years of experience, but the company policy is that for new hires, people that are just coming on board, that you get 2 weeks. If you're an experienced employee and you've been on board for 5 years, you get 3 weeks. 10 years, you get 4 weeks. but you, as I said, you've got 15 or 20 years of experience. Sometimes you can negotiate the additional experienced employee vacation time, and that's worth an extra kick to you in terms of your overall compensation, because that's actual time you're not working that you're getting paid for. And so it's something to begin thinking about. For many of us, we belong to professional organizations. And so professional dues might be rather expensive, particularly if you belong to several different organizations. And you can often negotiate those kinds of fees or dues with a new employer and have them pay for it. In relocation, there's a number of different things. And one in particular I want to talk about is gross up, and you'll understand that in just a minute. But moving and temporary living, where they put you up as you're making a move. When I first came to Houston, they put me up for 30 days in a hotel. They could pay a mortgage differential. So if you have a mortgage rate of X percent, let's say 4% on your old mortgage, but mortgages have gone up since the time that you negotiated the last mortgage, and now you're going to need to pay, let's say 6%. Sometimes the company will pay that differential. They may also pay closing costs. In these days, companies are less willing to pay all of that, but there's still things that you can negotiate. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. I wanted to talk about gross up, and here's where I can cover some of the things that I was just alluding to. A gross up, and a lot of people don't know about this, but I had grown up in HR, and so that was how I learned about it. A gross up is when the company will pay the taxes on any upfront bonuses or sign-on bonuses that they pay you on the front end, because that's construed as income. And that could cost a lot of money for somebody getting, tens of thousands of dollars as a sign-on bonus. And so if you ask for a gross up, what they also do is they throw in an additional amount to cover some of those taxes. That happened, in fact. My nephew was making a move from Virginia to the New Jersey area, and he was coming on with this new company, and he told me that they didn't want to pay for all these relocation costs. But what they did was they said they would give him $20,000 to cover it all, and then he would need to take care of it himself. And that was fine, except that the typical cost of a relocation could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000. But $20,000 certainly helps out a little bit. And so I talked to him about gross up, and I suggested that he go back to the hiring manager and to HR and discuss that with them. And so he went back and he asked them about a gross up, and they said, okay, we'll throw in another 10. So he increased his sign-on bonus by 50% just by asking for it and knowing what to ask for. Another kind of benefit that you can negotiate very often on the front end are severance packages. And typically, you don't want to talk about leaving when you're first coming on, but the reality of it is that, particularly in senior management, that the mortality rate or the lifespan of senior managers seems to be getting lower and lower. And so being able to negotiate and have in writing what the company will do if they ask you to leave before you intended to is a nice way of being able to bridge from the current situation that you're in to go through that transition. And it really takes a lot of the stress and anxiety out of the whole process that you have to go through should you find yourself in a career transition. Some of the other things you can negotiate, of course, have to do with personal focus and then community focus as well. So where in the job search process do you need to negotiate or start thinking about negotiations? And to me, it actually takes place throughout the whole process. Having worked with thousands of people in job search and in career transition, what they taught me was that the job search process really is 4 steps. First is to take stock of yourself and understand what your skills are. That's what you can do. Understand what your interests are, what your passions are, what you want to do, and then understand the kind of environment or culture that you can work in based on your personality and your values. That's the self-assessment piece. The second piece is to understand the marketplace. And a key in being able to find a new job is being able to demonstrate the kinds of problems that you've solved by understanding the problems that a potential employer has and then aligning those to show that you can solve the kinds of problems that your prospective employer has. And that takes market research. And so it doesn't have to be lengthy market research, but it has to be focused around what are the key challenges or problems and future problems that your prospective employer is likely to have that you can solve and that you've solved in the past and that you can demonstrate that you've gotten tangible results for. Some job search actions are putting together the resume, and notice that putting together the resume is the third thing in the process, because after you've done this self-evaluation and whatnot, you're in a much better place to, and the market research, you're in a much better place to set up your resume. It's writing your cover letters, it's your interviewing, it's your prospecting, it's your networking, all those kinds of things take place in the job search actions. And then the last thing is to pick opportunities. And I'm being very specific here in terms of picking opportunities, because if you work with me as a career coach, and you're in transition, I don't want to help you just find a job. What I want you to do is I want you to generate opportunities and be able to pick the opportunity that best aligns with your needs. And you can't do that unless you've looked at yourself and figured that out. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first assessment is a self-assessment. And as I talked about, looking at skills, interests, personality, and values. Your skills talk about what it is that you can do. Your interests talk about what it is that you want to do. And your personality and values talk about the kind of personality that you bring to the organization and where will you fit the best. So it describes the chemistry or the fit. Where those three meet, that helps to describe your ideal job, both in terms of what you do, but also the kind of organization that you might want to work in. The second assessment, and so this is part of the negotiations process, because you really need to start doing this even before you have any interviews, is figuring out and doing your homework around what are your family needs? What are your housing needs? What do you have needs in terms of savings? Do you have kids that are going to be going to school, going to college? Do you need to save for retirement? What is your personal circumstances in terms of the money tree that you're trying to build, and why? What kind of money do you need in order to maintain your lifestyle, travel, vacations, cars, and other things? And so you need to think about all of these things as you think about what it is that you want to negotiate and what's a priority in terms of your negotiations. So here's a cartoon I found. Salary is negotiable, take it or leave it. And I've been in situations like this where people have suggested a salary that was far under what I needed. And then I can go back and either try to negotiate it. And if they're not willing to negotiate and it doesn't meet my needs, then, or I don't meet their needs, then we have a clear decision and we just have to move ahead. But the key here is that information is power and we need to do some research. So you ask the question, where do I research? What do I research? And here's some examples. What are the key challenges of the organization and or industry? So you really want to find out what are the problems or challenges that an organization faces, and what are the problems of the industry? What are the problems going forward? And which are the ones that I've worked on before? What issues is my prospective employer currently facing? What issues may they face in the future? How do I add value? Thinking back about assignments that you've had, projects you've worked on, positions you've been in, what was the value that you add? And I've worked with many, many people, particularly people that are technically oriented, engineers, scientists, computer people, and they say, well, I don't add any value, I just do my job. Well, they wouldn't hire you unless you added some value. And you need to be able to connect the dots and be able to articulate what that value is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. What problems have I solved in the past that are similar to the ones that prospective employers have now or may have in the future? And you can think about a narrative to be able to describe what it is that you did and what results that you got. And the key in talking about that, we'll get to just shortly about how you go about putting together that narrative. What are the organizations willing to pay for these skills and or solutions? So having an idea about what organizations are willing to pay in the marketplace that you're searching, because different locations pay a different amount. The cost of living, for example, in New York City is quite different than the cost of living in Tennessee or in California or in Houston, Texas. And so understanding what that marketplace is and what people in your title make is really important. But it's also important to understand that from a geographic perspective, because in different geographies, the same job gets paid differently. So here's some things to research. Do a review of the projects, assignments, or jobs you've had over the last 10 years. Analyze what problems you solved and what results you've got. It's really important when you can to use metrics. And the metrics actually come in 4 sizes: quantity, quality, cost savings, and time. So then you can create a list of accomplishments that you can use to show that you're a star. And if you really want to soar in your presentation and also on your resume, what you want to do is be able to use this outline that I'm talking about in terms of a star by describing what situations you were in, what tasks you took place in, and what tasks you were working on, what actions you took, and what results you got. And so again, the results should be described in terms of quantity, quality, cost, or time. Now, this doesn't have to be long-winded, but it should be powerful. And so you can give an example, and one that comes to mind right now is I managed a $1.5 billion construction of a new refinery with 100 employees. And we were able to complete the construction. It was an 18-month project, and we were able to complete the project 2 months under our deadline and save 5% off the budget, saving X number of dollars. And that's the kind of way that you want to be able to speak, to be able to create sizzle in the presentation and to resonate with a potential employer. Now, the key here also is that the particular situation, task, actions, and results, these are called accomplishment statements. The particular accomplishments that you talk about should be ones that align with the particular problems that that employer has currently, the things that keep them awake at night. And the more that you can demonstrate that you solve problems that keep them awake at night, what do you think happens to your candidacy and to where you are on the list of candidates that are being considered to be hired? So some other places to research. Of course, online, and Google is one of your best friends. You can go in and do searches about salary and the like. Some of the places that have information about the kind of money that you might make online might be Indeed Salary Search, salary.com, Glassdoor, Salary Expert, Salary List, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's BLS.gov. It's the Occupational Outlook Handbook. Is also very useful for seeing job descriptions and other information about different kinds of positions. I might say that if you would like to get these slides, they're on my LinkedIn profile. So all you need to do is go to my LinkedIn profile and you should be able to see it there on the first page. Some more information about where to research offline. You can go in the library, the American Almanac of Jobs and Salaries, and so that lists different jobs, job descriptions, and salaries. Another thing you can do is you can Google your job title and see what descriptions come up. That's also a clue that helps you in terms of looking at what are they looking for versus if you did your self-assessment and you look at your own skills and experience, how do those align? And that will help you to interview. And it'll also help you in terms of your negotiations, because you can then position yourself as strong in particular areas that a prospective employer has the most or most difficult problems. Some other information in terms of books you can look at, the Occupational Outlook Handbook. I had mentioned Richard Bowles, B-O-L-L-E-S, What Color is Your Parachute? That's being done as an annual every year. And while it's not critical to have the most up-to-date, I think the most recent one obviously is the 2020 edition. But if you go back to the 2019 or 2018, the basic foundation of what he's describing and how he describes it is very similar. What they do is they update it every year, putting in new information as the job market and technology change that impact on job search. Another one by C. Voss, Never Split the Difference, which talks about negotiations. One other resource that's really good, and he's doing it as an annual as well, and it's similar to Bowles, but takes a little bit different tact, is a book by Martin Yate, and it's called Knock 'em Dead. And you can do a search for Yate, that book will come up. But you can get all of these at Barnes & Noble or on Amazon or your favorite bookseller. A great source of information in terms of salary is that many professional organizations do salary surveys, and they break it down by position. In other words, the title, where you are in the hierarchy, and also location. So the first organization, I'm sorry for the alphabet soup, it's the American Institute for Chemical Engineers. The second one is the association, the American Society for Mechanical Engineers. ATD is the Association for Training and Development. SHRM is the Society for Human Resource Management. Of course, it would behoove you to think about what organization represents your particular profession and then contact them first. A great source of information is networking with friends, colleagues, and professional contacts. And I never ask people outright, what is it that you make? But I phrase it by setting it up in terms of a generic context. So if somebody is moving to San Diego, for example, and they're at this level in the organization, what do you think somebody in this particular job might make? What kind of range should I be looking for? And that's often very, very helpful to get that kind of feedback. And it provides a really good context, particularly once you've done the research by going into some of the books and looking at online information. And the other thing too is that as you do informational interviews and job interviews, I know that sometimes people tell me that they got an offer in a company that they're not interested in at all. But the value of getting that offer is that it provides a context, at least, for what companies are willing to pay for a particular job title that you might be interested in. So it might be a really good reason for taking a job interview, let alone not only just for the getting an offer and understanding what kind of money they're talking about for that job, but also to just get the practice in a situation where you may not be interested. And so the risk in that job is a lot lower, because if you don't get it, it's no big deal and you didn't care anyway. So just a couple of tips about not only where to research, but what you might think about in terms of your job interviewing. So when you negotiate and evaluate an offer, how do you do that? First of all, if you go back to that self-assessment, both assessment 1 and 2, and think about what are the criteria, what are the things that are important to you, and then you list them on the left side of the page. And if you remember early on, I said that the objective for me in a job search isn't to find a job, but to find a job that fits me the best. There's no job that's going to fit exactly 100%. And so the idea is how do you find the job that aligns the closest with what your needs are? And so on the right side of the page, I put offer 1, offer 2, offer 3, and then go down, and you can use a simple weighting system looking at 1, 2, and 3, 1 for low, 2 for medium, 3 for high. And then as you go down and add up the numbers across the offers, you can take a look and see which offer has the highest number. And that's a mathematical way to do it. When you get to the end of the list, if the math doesn't work out so that in your gut something is off, then you can go back and start thinking about, so what was it about offer 1 or offer 3 that seems to me intuitively different than the numbers that I'm showing, and why do I seem to be pulled to this job or that job? But at least it gets you thinking about those things, and it gives you a method for being able to evaluate which of the offers you want to take. It also gives you an opportunity to go back, and let's say that on offer 1, they offered you more money than on offer 3, but on offer 3, you like the people better, you like to work better. There's a commute that is very reasonable. It's only 15 minutes from your house, and so forth and so on. So there's a number of other factors that might make you want to go to offer 3, but it's not as much money as offer 1. And if you've got those several offers at one together, you're in a much better place for being able to play off one offer against the other in order to be able to get what you want, and to make sure that you're satisfied with the final outcome of the job that you accept. So what is it that an employer wants to know? Basically, whether you interview for an hour or 10 hours, or a whole day, or more than a day, there's 4 questions that an employer is wanting to know. Can you do the job? And that is based on your skills and experience. What have you done before? What are the results that you've gotten? And the more, again, that you align what you've done in the past with what the needs of this employer are in terms of their problems and their challenges, that means that you need to go out and do some research to find out what are the key business problems that this employer is having today, and then think about what you've done in the past that have impacted on those same problems. Another question is will you do the job? And that relates to your interests. So the issue is if I asked you in the audience, how many of you out there can, and ask you to raise your hand, how many of you out there can iron a shirt so that you feel comfortable in going out and wearing that shirt and that you look presentable? Probably most of you would be able to do that, and you would raise your hand. And so you've got that skill. So the next question as a career planner or career counselor might be, so why don't you then take a job in a laundry? And the issue is because it's probably not appropriate for you, and it's not the job of your dreams. It's not where your passion is. So you can have a skill, but not have the passion to do it. And so the key here is not only do you need to have the skill, but you also need to have the passion. There may be a situation where you have a passion, but then you don't have the skill. And so there's another solution to that. At one point in my life, I was very interested in learning how to fly an airplane. And in fact, every time that an airplane would go overhead and I would hear the engine, I would be looking up and identifying the airplane that was flying over me. And so if I wanted to get a job as a pilot, at that point, I didn't have the skill to do it. And so the solution then would be, as most of you are probably thinking, that if I have a passion and I don't have a skill, if it's appropriate, if it's the right time in your life and the circumstances are correct, you can go back and close that gap by taking training. And so when you go and look at the skills that you have and compare that with the job that you want, what are the gaps and what is it that you need to do in terms of training or professional development that will help to close that gap so you can do the job that you love. A really big question, and sometimes a knockout question, is will you fit? And that ties back to chemistry. And I've talked to many managers, hiring managers over the years, and asked them, if you had a candidate A who was a top individual and they consistently are able to be a top employee, but they're hard to get along with and they don't interact well with the rest of the team. And then you have another candidate B, who is adequate, but gets along great with the team and is easy to get along with, a real team player. Who would you hire? And almost 100%, they tell me that they would hire candidate B. And what they say is, I can always train people and teach people the skills they need. But one of the things that is much harder to train and much harder to teach are the team skills and the interpersonal skills that you need to have in order to fit well and get along with people and manage the politics in the organization. So will you fit? The chemistry can be a knockout factor. And that's an issue that you want to be able to present well around when you go in and you're interviewing. And it certainly helps in terms of how you negotiate, because if you come across as likable and they want you to be on the team, they're much more willing to negotiate a higher amount within the range of what they've got budgeted in order to get you on board. And of course, the last question is how much, and that's just a straight out number. What's it going to cost me to bring you on board? So some critical questions and answers for negotiations are, when is it in your best interest to negotiate? And the simple answer is always. And I told you the story about that woman who had gotten a nice offer, but she went back and she said that she would like $5,000 more. And he said done, and they just moved on. And she came on board the next work day. And I told you the story about my nephew. What salary were you thinking about? And so you should have a salary range in mind. Typically, the way I like to answer that is that I like to be towards the higher end of the range. And so again, this goes back to you thinking about not only what you're making now, but also doing some research about what people typically get paid in that particular job. How much were you making on your last job? That may be relevant or irrelevant. And so very often I might answer that by just saying, that's really irrelevant. What is much more relevant and what I would like to look at is, what are the responsibilities of this job? What does the marketplace typically pay in terms of being able to do a competent job on these responsibilities? And so where does it come out that that the company needs to be looking at in terms of what they're going to pay for anybody in this marketplace for that job? your last salary is really irrelevant. I know when I started my career, I was teaching. My first job was at a small university, a small college. And then I started looking at a job at a small company, actually in the Wall Street area, that you might have heard of, called RCA. And they asked me the question about what were you making on your last job? And it was like comparing apples and oranges. And I said, well, a teaching job really is different than a job in corporate America, working for a Fortune 50 company. And so why don't we start out by looking at what it is? And the duties are going to be very different. So why don't we start out looking at what it is that you're looking for, and whether or not there's a match between the skills that I bring to the job and what is required. And I said, typically, I know that companies of your size usually do salary studies and what they call job benchmarking. And so, what range do you put on the job? And I'm sure that we can reach a reasonable accommodation. What's the minimum you'll take? And typically, I like to answer that by saying, while I appreciate you're asking about the minimum, my objective is to make the maximum. And so what I'd like to do is be able to come to some accord that makes sense for you and for me both. What happens if there's a 3-month period before starting healthcare? And I would ask, is there a way that they might be able to help bridge the gap? Or it might mean that you might just have to suck that up. I mean, the best scenario is that you have no healthcare costs in that 3-month period, and so net, there's nothing out of pocket. The worst scenario is that you have some health situations, either with yourself or somebody in your family, and there might be a cost to that, and that might be a negotiable. What happens if a new employee gets 2 weeks vacation, but you have 20 years of experience? At the very least, I would ask for what a 20-year experienced employee gets in vacation at this new organization, and see if there's, again, a way that you can negotiate. And you might be surprised. You might get an extra week or 2, or you might get the experienced employee package. What happens well, if you are aware that most employees at your level get stock options, but they didn't mention it? My answer would be mention it and ask for it and see what they tell you. What happens if you have to relocate, but they don't pay relocation expenses? You could ask for a sign-on bonus. You could ask for other ways, or what ideas do they have where they might be able to help you out in terms of making in picking up at least some of the expenses, or making it a little bit easier for you to do the relocation. What might be covered under relocation expenses is another good question. How do you respond to salary offers much lower than your expectations? And I've seen people that have taken jobs that actually pay less, and also that have been in positions that are a lower title than they've had before. I think the question needs to be, and everybody needs to think through that for themselves. It's very individual in terms of the response that you make. But I think that you need to think about it in terms of what rate of progression can I expect? Can I do an early review? One opportunity is there for me to be able to make up the difference as I go along, and even exceed what I was making in the past. Is that important now? Is this a particular job that everything fits except for the salary, and I would love the job, and I would be able to live on the money that they're talking about? So it's very, very individual, and you need to think through and do that assessment that I was talking about on your own, to think about, does this make sense for you? What else can you ask for? If you're in a senior position, it could be a country club, car travel expenses, parking, professional memberships, meetings. But I wouldn't leave that stuff on the table. The other thing too is that I would look at what are the priorities. So if I have a really great job, but they don't offer me a car, and and I look at what they're offering me in salary, and that outweighs the money that I would save if they did give me a car, then do I want to take this job? Again, it's very individual, but these are the kinds of things why it's absolutely critical to do that assessment and see what are the priorities for you. So here's some of Bowles' 6 secrets of negotiation, and this comes from chapter 5 of What Color is Your Parachute? In this particular case, I used the 2017 version. Never discuss salary until the end of the whole interviewing process, when and if they have definitely said they want you. And so what this basically means is to try to delay that discussion. What it turns out is that the person or entity that brings up salary first and puts a number on the table is typically the loser. And so you want to put off that negotiation until you know that they really want you. And that raises the stakes for them and the likelihood. That's when you have your most power and leverage for negotiation. You need to remember the purpose of salary negotiation is to uncover the most they're willing to pay to get you. Never be the first to mention the salary figure. Before the interview, do some careful research on typical salaries for your field. We've talked about that. Research the range that the employer likely has in mind. Then define an interrelated range, one that overlaps for yourself relative to the employer's range. And that can really help lock the deal. Know how to bring the salary negotiation to a close. Don't just leave it all hanging. And I always ask for things in writing. So, and it can be done in a very professional manner just by saying, will you be sending me, or will human resources be sending me a summary of what we've discussed and what the offer looks like? But I want to see it in writing. I know on one job that I took when I first came to Houston, I had discussed and negotiated an early performance review with my boss, and early being after 6 months. And after 6 months, I went to my boss and said to him, when you hired me, we discussed an early review, and I'd like to sit down and do that review now and see if there's a way that you might be able to increase my salary. And he said, I don't remember that discussion. And I didn't have it in writing. So that was a really good lesson for me to make sure that everything that you discuss, all the terms, even things that you negotiate, are actually in a letter or some sort of document that lays all of that out. If they, in fact, don't provide that for you, what I would recommend is that you put one together and send it to them. And you use the proviso that unless I hear from you differently, I will assume that these are the things that we agreed on, and then sign it and send it to them. And at least you have all those things in writing and it's all documented. It's just a good professional way and business-like way of being able to have a contract where you have common understanding of what agreement you have. So that concludes the presentation. It's now time for questions. Mara, I'll turn it over to you for the questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a lot of information, a lot of really great information, and we have got a lot of questions accordingly. Unfortunately, we probably won't be able to get to all of the questions, but I'm going to ask some of the most common questions we've had and try and go in order. So one of the first questions that came up was, how can you start a negotiation during a performance review?
Well, performance review is a different situation than a negotiation in terms of looking for a job, obviously. But what I would do with the performance review, I think part of your negotiation in the performance review depends on you having data. And so not only when I was in the role internally of organizational development, and we were teaching managers about performance evaluation and also employees about performance evaluation, what I was suggesting is that as an employee that you prepare for your performance evaluation. And so you collect these accomplishments, you collect these, look at the projects that you've been on, look at the assignments that you've been on, and look at the results that you've gotten. Look at the goals that you were supposed to accomplish or work towards, and have clear data as to what you did, who was involved, and what results you got. And as you're having the performance discussion, that because your boss might not know all of the things that you actually did over the course of the year. And so there should be a back and forth helping you to give input to the boss to help him or her to understand what your value is. And then at the end of that, that's when you can discuss negotiations and ask for an appropriate raise based on that value that you've added. But it's up to you to connect the dots in order to look at the value that you add throughout the year.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions on similar topic about online applications where they ask you upfront for your salary requirement or even salary history. How would you recommend filling out those forms?
That's a really good question, and it's a tricky one. The problem is, or it used to be, that if, and let's say an ad asks for, please include salary requirements, you could say something like on a cover letter, and this isn't online, this is the old way, saying in a cover letter that salary is negotiable. I'd like to discuss that during the interview. But that's not the same for an online application. When you fill out an online application, one of the problems is that when you hit submit, unless you have a number in that box, the submit won't light up and it won't let you submit it. So you have to put a number in there. There's two different theories about that. One way is to do some research about what the range is on the job. And you could look at the midpoint in that range and put in the number for the midpoint. Another way is moving a little bit up from the midpoint towards the middle between the mid and the end point and putting that number in. I've also heard people putting in a higher number. The problem is that if your number is way out on the end of the range, as they look at candidates and the machine is going through and sifting through, the automated tracking system is going through, or the applicant tracking system is going through and looking at those numbers, it may be programmed to kick out the higher numbers. So if you want to overlap, what I would do is probably put in something closer to the midpoint where there's an overlap. And then, of course, you can go in and use all the techniques and tools that I've discussed here for negotiating salary, but you got to get the interview. And so that's how I would handle that on an online application.
Thank you. We had a couple of people asking, in current circumstances, where it's really employers' market, and given the coronavirus pandemic, would you suggest making any adjustment to these negotiation strategies given the current climate, or how has negotiation changed?
You know, my answer is two things. What value do you add? And the way that you determine the value add is by looking at what are people paying in the marketplace. So if you're looking at a mid-sized to a larger company, typically they're not going to, I don't think that they're going to be squeezing you and trying to move their salaries downward. They do salary evaluations and job evaluations and what they call benchmarking of what pay is of competitors in the marketplace. And they know what range they want to pay for that job. And so in that particular situation, my thinking is that you go in and you negotiate in good faith. The key, though, is how can you demonstrate to the employer that you're going to add value for them? And the more that you can articulate what your value is by looking at accomplishments, looking at problems solved, and aligning those problems with problems that they have, the more valuable you are. And I would negotiate from that perspective. the last criterion is, how much do you like the job? You know, is everything great except that you'd like another $1,000 or $5,000? You know, and that's subjective, and you have to figure that out for yourself. But if everything works, then one of the things I might negotiate might be an early review, or looking at what you might be able to do in terms of your career track within the organization to be able to advance and ultimately make what you want or make beyond that.
Makes a lot of sense. Someone has asked if the company has a trial period, such as before benefits kick in. Is that something that's ever or generally negotiable, or is that usually a policy?
Everything is negotiable. Typically, though, if they have hard and fast policy, and that's the policy that they stick to, the likelihood of you being able to change that policy or make an exception is fairly low. My advice is, you know, what do you have to lose by asking?
We've got a lot of questions from people very uncomfortable with the questions that they hear from interviewers about salary range, which I know we addressed a bit earlier. How would you respond on the phone or in person when you're faced with, you know, what is your expected salary? You know, can you give us a couple of examples of different ways to handle that question?
Yes, absolutely. The first way, and I can tell you that this works most of the time, is to turn the question around. And I just address it head on. And I've used this many times when I was a candidate and interviewing. And I would say to them, I'm really glad you asked that question. I know that often organizations of your size or organizations like yours do salary surveys and have an idea about what they want to pay. What range are you putting on the job? And you'd be surprised how often they just answer the question. But once they do that and they've given me a number, then I have intelligence, I have information that I can respond within or close to the numbers that they're putting out. And I know it gives me a better, something tangible in order to be able to make a response to them. I've also hit some, you know, crusty old managers that have been around for a long time, and they say basically, come off it. You know, we just want to know a number. What's the number? And then what I would do is the same thing that I talked about in terms of the dollars that you put on an application. I would have looked at the research before I went in about what the salary range is for that particular title, and have an idea about what most companies are paying in that position, and try to raise it maybe to the 75% quartile or the 75% level, and say, look, you know, the objective obviously is to get the maximum that I can, but I also want to be within your guidelines. And so I would like to, what I'm looking at is somewhere in the range of 60,000 to 75,000. And I would try to give a range. The more that you can give a range instead of one number, the more likely you are to be able to overlap with what they're thinking.
Thank you. I think we only have time for one, maybe two more questions. So one question that came up is someone asked if you could explain how to politely, diplomatically bring up severance package negotiation.
Yeah, it depends on what level you are in the organization, but if typically severance packages are given for more senior individuals. And so I think I would just bring it up as a matter of fact way and say, you know, very often in the positions that I'm going into, the longevity of people in at that level seems to be getting lower and lower over the years. And I'm wondering what your policy is on severance packages, and what we might be able to talk about and agree to as I'm coming in to take this job. I know that you're trying to minimize risk. I'm trying to minimize risk. And so we just need to come to some accord that makes sense for both of us.
Thank you. Last question that we have time for, unfortunately we're out of time, is someone has asked, is there room to negotiate the job title when you're looking at a new opportunity? For example, seniority level or the name of the position?
The answer is yes. And again, it depends on the size of the organization. In smaller, less formal organizations, there might be some more room to be able to change a title, let's say from manager to director or from director to vice president or whatever. One of the keys is being clear about what the job duties are and what they're requiring you to do. And I probably would do my research and look at what other titles or what other companies, what title other companies put on that kind of job with that range of duties. And so what human resources, if they have an HR department, is going to do is they're going to look at the breadth and depth. How quickly do you impact on the organization? Do your decisions move through and have a large impact? What responsibility do you have? How large is the budgets that you control? How many people are you managing? Those are all questions that go towards being able to put a label on what title you have, whether it's individual contributor, a supervisor, manager, director, etc.
Thank you. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Mark, for all of your insights and advice. And thank you to all of the participants and attendees for being here and submitting great questions. Just a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar and all of the information in there so that you can revisit the wonderful information that Mark has shared with us today. So,
thank you for having me, Mara. I enjoyed it, and I hope that the participants found it useful.
yes, thank you so much, and we hope that everyone has a great day.